They say you can't choose your family, but maybe you can choose to walk away from them, and maybe that's the same thing. My name is Callista Wren. I'm 32 years old, and last summer, I found out exactly what family loyalty meant when you have nothing in your pockets but loose change and a little too much pride. The reunion was my mother's idea, or rather, my mother's sister's idea. Aunt Verity, the matriarch, the one with the money, the estates, the delicate garden parties that always reeked of lavender and disappointment. She'd sent out the invitations in gold-trimmed envelopes that probably cost more than I'd spent on groceries for the month. I'd read the invitation 3 times before daring to believe it. Then I made a fatal mistake. I said yes. I packed my one good dress, a pair of sensible flats that I'd worn so thin they didn't dare dream of a puddle, and took the 2 trains and 1 bus it took to get from my small, cold studio in Manchester to the rolling hills of Somerset. You'd think there'd be a warm welcome waiting for me, seeing as I hadn't seen most of them in a decade. But you'd be wrong. The second I stepped out of the hired cab, driver watching me like he knew I didn't belong, I knew I'd made a mistake. The Wren family mansion loomed in front of me, all dark ivy and stone, windows reflecting the setting sun like watchful eyes. I caught sight of the other cars, sleek black saloons, polished Range Rovers, a Porsche that probably cost more than my annual salary 3 times over. The driver coughed, and I realized I was clutching my bag so tight, the cheap leather dug into my palm. "Good luck, miss," he said with a smirk, and drove away, tires crunching on the gravel drive. I stepped inside, heart in my throat. The first thing that hit me was the laughter, light, airy, so casual. I could hear the clink of glasses, the polite tinkle of a grand piano, someone's boisterous toast that ended in a wave of brittle laughter. I wanted to run, but I squared my shoulders instead. I'd promised my mother before she died that I'd try, that I'd show them I was worth something. So I went in. The ballroom was bigger than my entire building back home. Chandeliers sparkled like distant galaxies, and the air smelled of roast meats and expensive perfumes. Cousins I barely recognized flitted about in shimmering gowns and crisp suits. And there was Aunt Verity, perched near the fireplace like a queen on her throne. Her eyes locked onto me immediately. "Callista," she said, drawing out the syllables like they tasted sour. "How unexpected." "Hello, Aunt Verity," I said. My voice cracked. No one else noticed. At least, no one pretended to. I got air kisses from some, tight nods from others. There were questions that weren't really questions. "What have you been up to all these years, dear? Are you still doing that art thing? Oh, you came by train, how quaint. It was all knives wrapped in silk." I smiled until my cheeks hurt. Dinner was worse. I sat at the far end of the long, gleaming table. Roast duck, glazed carrots, wine that made my tongue sting. I ate slowly, conscious of the tattered hem on my sleeve, the scuffed shoes hidden beneath the tablecloth. They talked about investments, property deals, someone's new startup that had just been bought for a mere 8 figures. When the talk turned to me, it was an interrogation. "So, Callista, you never did marry, did you?" Verity asked, her eyes sharp as broken glass. "Didn't find the right person," I said, forcing a smile. Truth was, I'd loved once. A boy with ink on his fingers and dreams bigger than our pockets. He died before he could make any of them real. I didn't tell them that. "And work? Are you settled?" "I'm doing freelance design work," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's going well." "Freelance," Verity repeated, lips curling. "Well, I suppose that's something." I drained my glass of wine and felt it burn all the way down. I wondered how long I had to stay to satisfy whatever test this was. After dinner, they moved into the drawing room for drinks and cigars. I lingered on the edge, listening to whispers. "Did you see her shoes? She brought that old bag again. Imagine not even having a car. How does she survive?" I clenched my fists so tight I thought I'd draw blood. I caught sight of the grand staircase winding up into shadows. I needed air. I needed out. I turned, meaning to slip outside, when I collided with someone. The scotch in his glass splashed onto my dress. "Watch it," the man snapped. "Cousin Edgar." He'd grown bloated with wine and inheritance. His wife giggled behind her hand. "I'm so sorry." I started, but he cut me off. "You don't belong here, Callista," Edgar slurred. "You're just here for the handouts, aren't you? Looking for a little charity from your betters?" The room went quiet. Verity stood, fanning herself slowly. Her eyes flicked to me, then to Edgar. "I think, perhaps," she said coolly, "it's best if you go, Callista. This isn't really your place, is it?" I couldn't breathe. I looked around the room, hoping for someone, anyone, to stand up for me. But they all turned away. A hush of silk skirts, the creak of leather shoes, and the weight of 100 unspoken judgments settled on my shoulders. I swallowed the shame. It tasted worse than the wine. "Fine," I said. "I'll go." I left the house with nothing but my bag and my dignity in tatters. The air outside was sharp, cutting through my thin dress like knives. I didn't look back. I didn't cry until I'd reached the edge of the estate, where the manicured lawns gave way to the dirt path that would take me to the road. There, under a lone street lamp, I let it all out. Years of wanting to belong, of wanting them to see me as more than the poor cousin from the art school phase. That night, I slept in the bus station, using my coat as a pillow. When I got home, I found an eviction notice pinned to my door. 2 months behind on rent. No new clients. I stared at the paper until the words blurred. I don't know how long I sat there. Maybe an hour. Maybe 10. But when I stood up, something inside me had cracked open. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to ask them for help. If they wanted to pretend I didn't exist, fine. I'd make sure the next time they heard my name, it would be carved into their world like a scar they couldn't ignore. I started small. I found a tiny co-working space that smelled like stale coffee and hope. I picked up every job I could: websites, logos, branding decks, pitch presentations for people who couldn't pay much but believed in me more than my family ever had. I worked until my eyes burned, until my fingers cramped. I skipped meals, I skipped sleep, I watched the zeros in my account grow from 2 to 3 to 4 digits. And then I met Declan. Declan Wright was the kind of man who made money move. He'd seen my design work for a local charity, tracked me down, and asked if I'd be willing to help him brand his new venture. "Can't pay much up front," he'd said, "but if this goes well, there's equity in it for you." Equity. That word tasted sweeter than wine. I signed the papers with shaking hands. The venture took off. Then, it took off again. And again. Each time, my stake grew. I bought a second-hand car. Then I bought a flat. I hired an assistant. I started investing back, little by little, into companies that reminded me of me, small, overlooked, hungry for a chance. One night, 3 years after they kicked me out, I sat in my office, staring at the acquisition offer that had just landed in my inbox. It was from Wright Holdings, the investment branch of Declan's company, now worth more than the Wren family's entire estate. I read the name of the company they wanted me to buy. My stomach dropped. Wren Family Estates Limited. My thumb hovered over the phone. I knew exactly what I'd say to Aunt Verity. I knew how I'd say it. But I didn't call. Not yet. I wanted them to feel the tremor first. To watch the cracks spread through their precious kingdom. The next day, I signed the papers. They'd thrown me out for being poor. They never knew I'd come back as the one thing they couldn't stand to lose. I own them now. And this is just the beginning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. I'd be lying if I said I didn't rehearse what I'd say the first time I saw them again. That first night after the ink dried on the contract, I sat in my new office, a glass box overlooking the Thames, and imagined myself standing in front of Aunt Verity, cousins flanking her like silent gargoyles. I'd picture her face, that tight, brittle smile that cracked when she was cornered. I'd picture the way Edgar's nose would wrinkle, the way the whispers would twist through the room like smoke. But fantasies are cheap. Reality costs more. And I'd learned enough about reality in the past 3 years to know that revenge tastes better when it's slow cooked. I didn't walk into that house with lawyers and paperwork the next day. Instead, I went home. Home was no longer my cold studio flat with the drafty windows and the flickering bulb in the hallway. It was a 3-bedroom townhouse in South Kensington, all exposed brick, warm hardwood floors, and walls covered in canvases, my canvases. I never sold my art after I'd made enough from design. It reminded me who I was, who I'd fought to become. I kicked off my shoes at the door, left my bag by the console table, and padded into the kitchen. It smelled like coffee and possibility. I brewed a cup, black and strong, and carried it out onto the tiny balcony that overlooked a courtyard garden filled with hydrangeas and the distant laughter of children. This was my space, my fortress, and tomorrow I'd take my first real step. The first step was information. I needed to know everything: who owned what, how deep their debts went, which parts of the estate bled money, and which parts made it. The truth was, the Wrens looked rich, but they were house poor in the worst way. Land rich, cash poor, desperate to keep up appearances. The taxes on those sweeping lawns and historic halls were crippling. The family trust had splintered over the years into a labyrinth of shell companies and petty rivalries. They'd kept it hidden well enough from the world, but not from me. I hired a private investigator, Noel. He looked more like an accountant than someone who could unravel a century of secrets, but that was exactly why I trusted him. Within a week, he had files stacked in neat piles on my dining table. Verity's secret offshore accounts, Edgar's gambling debts, the hush-hush mortgage they'd taken against the Summer Manor to pay for cousin Arabella's second wedding after the first husband skipped town with her best friend. Noel watched me read each page, my fingers trembling. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked once as I closed the last folder. I looked at him. He'd grown up poor too. He'd told me once over cheap takeaway that his mum used to hide the rent money in the lining of her coat so his dad wouldn't spend it at the pub. "Do I want to?" "No," I said, "but they taught me what family means. Now I'm just giving them the courtesy of a lesson in return." He nodded once, quietly respectful. He never asked again. The next step was presence. They needed to see my name, not my face, not yet, but the letters that spelled out Callista Wren, in bold gold leaf on stationery they'd never expect. I started small. I bought up the boutique florist that supplied the estate's garden parties. Then I snapped up the catering company they'd used for every family reunion since before I was born. Next, I acquired the event management firm that rented out their ballroom for weddings and corporate retreats. Each time I signed a deal, I sent the new contracts to the estate's business office. My name at the bottom, my logo at the top. A little calling card that said, "You may have turned me away, but I've been here all along." Weeks turned into months. I let it simmer, let the tension coil like a watch spring. The calls started coming in, Verity's assistant, polite and cloying, asking for a meeting. "Miss Wren, Lady Verity would like to invite you to tea to discuss, well, perhaps a more beneficial arrangement." I could almost hear my aunt's teeth grinding through the line. I declined the first time. And the second. By the third, the note came handwritten on thick cream parchment. I could feel the desperation between the lines. That's when I knew it was time. I asked Declan to come with me. He'd become more than a business partner over the years. He was the big brother I'd wished for when I was a kid, hiding under my blankets, counting the days until my mother's next letter. He knew when to stand beside me and when to stand back. "You sure you don't want to hit them with the full legal hammer?" he asked as we drove down the familiar country lanes, past hedgerows and sheep meadows that looked like postcards. I shook my head. "No, they'll never respect that. They'll just say I bought my way in. I want them to see me for what I am, what they made me into." We pulled up to the estate just as the sun was dipping behind the hills, painting the old house in gold and bruised purple. It looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I'd just grown too big for its walls. The butler, Percy, same as ever, silver-haired and soft-spoken, opened the door. He looked at me like he'd seen a ghost. "Miss Wren, it's been some time." I wanted to hug him, tell him I remembered how he used to sneak me extra biscuits when Verity wasn't looking. But I didn't. Not yet. There would be time for kindness later. Verity waited in the drawing room. Same fireplace, same velvet chairs. She looked older, smaller somehow, like a balloon that had slowly deflated. Edgar was there too, standing by the liquor cabinet with a glass that rattled against his teeth. Arabella perched on the settee, eyes darting between me and Declan. "Callista," Verity said, her voice brittle. "So good of you to come." I sank into the chair opposite her, crossing my legs slowly. "Let's not waste time with pleasantries. You wanted to talk." She flinched, just slightly. Edgar cleared his throat, glaring at Declan. "Who's this, then? Your bodyguard?" Declan smiled, all teeth and warmth. "I'm here to make sure she gets what's hers." Silence. Verity folded her hands in her lap, the diamonds on her fingers glinting in the firelight. "We've been made aware," she began carefully, "that you have interests in certain businesses connected to the estate. This is unexpected." I leaned forward. "No, Aunt Verity. What was unexpected was being thrown out of this house for being poor. What was unexpected was sleeping in a bus station, because you couldn't stand the shame of having me near your precious silver spoons." Arabella made a small sound. Whether it was pity or shock, I couldn't tell. Edgar just snorted. "You've made your point," Verity snapped. "What do you want? Money? Shares? A seat at the board?" I laughed, sharp and humorless. "I already have those. What I want is your silence. Sign over controlling interest in the estate's event operations, the catering, the florist, the rental arm, everything that you can't keep afloat without my money. You'll still live here, you'll still play queen at your garden parties, but every time you pour a glass of champagne, you'll know it came from my pocket." Verity's face went white. Edgar lurched forward, sloshing whiskey onto the carpet. "You little," he started, but Declan cut him off with a glare that could have stopped a train. I stood. "I'm not asking for your blessing. I'm telling you how it is. You can sign willingly, or I'll make this very public and very messy. And trust me, the press loves a good story about old money falling apart." Verity's hands trembled. I almost pitied her. Almost. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do this to your own family?" I met her eyes, steady and unflinching. "Because family isn't about blood. It's about loyalty, and you lost mine the night you kicked me out." I turned to go, Declan following. At the door I paused, looking back at the house that had once been my cage. I felt lighter than I had in years. "I'll expect those papers by Monday," I said. "And Verity, if you ever think about crossing me again, remember, I'm not the same scared girl you threw out. I'm the woman who owns your future." Outside the night was cool and clean. I breathed it in, the air sharp in my lungs. "This is just the beginning," I murmured to Declan as we walked to the car. And I knew, deep in my bones, that it was true. Some debts are paid in cash, others in power, but the biggest ones are paid in respect. And I was collecting every last penny. The drive back from the estate felt like an exorcism, like I'd left a ghost behind in those stone walls. Declan didn't say much, and I was grateful for the silence. I watched the hedgerows blur into darkness, street lights flickering like distant promises. My mind was already turning the next page. I didn't sleep that night. I made coffee, strong enough to burn a hole in my stomach, and spread out the new stack of papers Noelle had dropped off while I was gone. Everything was in motion now. The transfers, the backroom negotiations, the careful threads that pulled the entire Wren empire into my hands. It should have felt like triumph, but it didn't, at least not yet. I kept seeing Verity's face, the way her lips had trembled, the way Edgar's hand had twitched around his glass, like he might throw it at me if Declan hadn't been there. I'd thought I'd feel vindicated, but it wasn't enough. I didn't want them ruined. I wanted them to remember. I wanted every room in that mansion to echo with my name. I wanted every dinner party and fundraiser to be served with the taste of the girl they'd cast out like trash. By dawn, I knew exactly how I'd do it. It started with the annual summer gala. For decades, the Wren Family Gala had been the highlight of the season. Politicians, CEOs, old money and new, all gathered under the chandeliers to drink champagne and pretend they weren't plotting each other's ruin behind polite smiles. It was Verity's crown jewel, her stage to show off the family's untouchable grace. This year, it would be mine. Declan balked when I told him. You want to host it? No, I said, sipping coffee gone cold. I want to sponsor it. And I want them to ask me to. He understood eventually. Verity wouldn't take my money outright. Not publicly. But the estate was leaking cash, and the gala was a black hole of expenses. So I made an offer they couldn't refuse. I'd underwrite the entire thing through my new events company, Wren Events Limited, and they'd keep their precious social standing intact. Of course, my name would be on every program, every invitation, every glass raised that night. It didn't take long for Verity to cave. Pride is expensive. The weeks that followed were a hurricane. I was in meetings from dawn till dusk, signing contracts, approving menus, picking floral arrangements that would cost more than my mother's entire funeral. I didn't do it alone. I'd built a team now. Designers, planners, caterers, decorators. Each one brilliant. Each one a testament to the life I'd clawed out of nothing. I worked till my voice went hoarse, till my eyes burned. But when I finally stood in the ballroom the morning of the gala, overseeing the last swirl of flowers being tucked into gold vases, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt powerful. The guests started arriving just before dusk. Luxury cars crept up the winding drive, headlights carving tunnels through the misty evening. From the balcony overlooking the drive, I watched them step out. Women in silks and diamonds, men in tailored suits that cost more than my old annual rent. They didn't see me yet. They didn't know. Inside, the ballroom had been transformed. Soft golden light spilled from the chandeliers. Roses, white, blush, and blood red, wound around the pillars like living veins. At the center, the crest of the Wren family, etched in ice, slowly melted into crystal bowls of caviar. I caught sight of Verity across the room. She was radiant, all smiles, her hair pinned into a flawless silver twist. But when our eyes met, hers flickered, just for a heartbeat. A flinch. She turned away quickly, burying herself in a conversation with the local MP. Edgar was already drunk, clutching a glass of expensive scotch like it was the only thing holding him up. Arabella floated through the room on her husband's arm. Husband number 3 now, I'd heard. Each new ring more desperate than the last. They looked exactly like they had that night they'd thrown me out. Only now they wore their shame like invisible shackles. I made my rounds, smiling, greeting old family friends who didn't recognize me at first. Some did double takes when they read my name on the sponsorship banner. Others whispered behind their hands, trying to connect the dots. Halfway through the evening, as the orchestra shifted from waltzes to soft jazz, Verity found me. She clutched a flute of champagne so tightly her knuckles whitened. "Callista?" she said, her smile painted on. "A word?" I let her lead me to a small alcove behind a velvet curtain, away from the curious eyes. The music thumped faintly through the walls like a second heartbeat. "You've made your point," she hissed, all that brittle composure splintering. "You think this is clever, parading yourself around like some savior?" I arched an eyebrow. "I didn't parade myself anywhere, Aunt Verity. You invited me. You took my money. This is your party as much as it is mine." Her hand trembled, spilling champagne onto the marble floor. "You don't belong here." I leaned in so close she could see the steel in my eyes. "I do now. I own every piece of it. And if you want your precious gala next year, you'll smile and nod and toast me like the rest." She slapped me. It wasn't hard, but it stung. Not the skin, my pride. But I refused to let her see it. I let the silence stretch until she shrank back. "Enjoy your party," I said, brushing past her. "It's the last time you'll ever think you're in control." I stepped back into the ballroom, the music swelling. Declan was waiting by the bar, watching me with that look, half concern, half admiration. "You good?" he asked. I touched my cheek, still tingling. "Better than good." An hour later, as the clock struck midnight and the champagne flowed like rivers of liquid gold, I raised my glass to the crowd. The entire room turned to me, Some faces confused, some curious, a few, Verity's included, tight with rage. "To family," I said, my voice carrying over the music. "May we always remember what we owe each other." They toasted with me. They had to. And in that moment, I knew I'd won. But victories come with consequences. As the last guests drifted out into the cold night and the staff began tearing down the flowers and banners, Declan pulled me aside. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. "Noel found something." My stomach turned. "What?" He handed me a manila folder, the edges crumpled from his tight grip. "Verity's been moving assets behind your back. She's trying to siphon money out of the accounts before the full transfer goes through. Offshore, under shell names." I flipped through the pages. Numbers, signatures, flight logs to Geneva. My pulse thundered in my ears. "She's not done yet," Declan said. "She's planning to run, leave the debts behind, take what she can, and vanish." The rage was instant, cold and pure. All my carefully laid plans, all my patience, it would mean nothing if she slipped away now. "I want her stopped," I said. "Whatever it takes." Declan's jaw tightened. "Callista, you're crossing a line." "I crossed it the night they kicked me out," I snapped. "Get Noel. Get whatever we need. I want her world locked down before she even thinks about booking a flight." He didn't argue, he just nodded. And for the first time that night, I felt the weight of what I'd become. This wasn't just revenge anymore, this was survival. And I'd learned too well how to survive to let it slip away now. I stayed awake till dawn again, reading every page, every loophole, every lie. By the time the sun rose, I had my plan. I would catch her before she could run. And this time, when I took everything from her, there would be no shadows to hide in. The morning after the gala, London felt colder than it had in years. Or maybe I was just seeing it through a new lens. The kind you get when you realize your own blood would rather burn down a kingdom than share it with you. Declan and I sat across from Noel in a corner booth at a small cafe near my office. I hadn't slept. My head was pounding from too much champagne, too many lies. I stirred my coffee, watching the swirl of cream like it might spell out an answer. Noel spread out the files across the table. Bank transfers, shadow accounts, falsified invoices, and old family deeds. Each piece a thread in Verity's last desperate escape plan. "She's liquidating as we speak," Noel said, tapping one page with a bitten-down fingernail. "She thinks she can wire the bulk offshore, launder it through shell companies. If she does, she'll be gone before you can file injunctions." Declan's jaw flexed. "What's our window?" Noel leaned back, looking at me. "A week, maybe less. She's booked flights for herself and Edgar. First class to Zurich. She's got legal cover too. Shells within shells. She's been planning this a long time." I set my cup down, forcing my hands to be steady. My reflection in the window stared back at me. Hollow-eyed, hair scraped into a tight bun. I didn't recognize the woman there anymore. Or maybe I did, and that was the scariest part. "Callista," Declan said softly, "there's still time to pull back. You have the companies. The estate can't survive without you. If you push this too far—" I cut him off with a look. "If I let her run, she'll take everything she can. She'll rebuild somewhere else. This doesn't end until it ends." Noel nodded, quietly respectful as always. "So what's the plan?" I looked at the folder spread out like a map of every betrayal I'd ever swallowed. "We trap her. We cut off the money. We freeze every asset, every account, every backup plan she's got. We make it impossible for her to breathe without remembering I own the air." Declan didn't argue this time. He just picked up a folder, his fingers brushing mine. "Then let's get to work." The next 48 hours were a blur. I called in every favor, every contact I'd made since the day I'd walked out of that mansion, with nothing but my bag and my pride. Lawyers who owed me wins, bankers who remembered the zeros I'd poured into their vaults, journalists who smelled blood in the water. One by one, we slammed every door Verity might run through. Her flights were canceled under fraud suspicion. Her offshore accounts flagged for investigation. The family's private trusts frozen under emergency injunctions. By the end of the second day, my phone was buzzing nonstop. Calls from the estate, from Arabella, from cousins who'd never cared if I was dead or alive until their inheritances were on the line. I ignored them all. On the third morning, Verity showed up at my office. I was on the phone with my lawyer when I saw her reflection in the glass wall. A ghost wrapped in a camel hair coat, eyes hidden behind huge black sunglasses. She looked so out of place here, among the sleek desks and open-plan hum of my empire. "Miss Wren, she says she won't leave," my assistant whispered. But I raised a hand. "It's fine. Send her in." Verity stepped inside like she owned the floor. Old habits die hard. She stood there, staring at me across my oak desk, the way she might stare at a stain she couldn't quite scrub out of the carpet. "Callista," her voice cracked. I'd never heard her voice crack before. "What are you doing?" I hung up the phone, leaning back in my chair. "Taking back what you owe me." She pulled off her glasses. Her eyes were rimmed red, mascara smudged. It didn't suit her, looking human. "You've won. You made your point. You've taken the estate, the trust, the businesses. Why destroy what's left? Think of the family name. Think of your mother." My mother's name in her mouth was a spark to dry tinder. "Don't you dare," I snapped. "My mother died in a rented room because you wouldn't lift a finger. You couldn't even send flowers." She flinched. "Good. Callista, I'm begging you." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "We're family." I stood slowly, every word a nail in the coffin she'd built for herself. Family is loyalty, Verity. Family is protecting each other when there's nothing left. You showed me what loyalty meant when you kicked me out because my shoes weren't shiny enough for your marble floors. Now I'm showing you what mine looks like." She sank into the chair across from me, a brittle statue in designer wool. "I have nothing left," she whispered. "If you do this, I have nothing." I wanted to tell her that was the point. That was the justice. But somewhere deep down, that small voice, the one that still wanted to be loved by this cruel, broken woman, made me pause. I leaned forward, my voice low. "Sign the final transfer. Everything. The last shares, the last deeds. You keep your house. One house. The one you sleep in. That's it. You step out of line once and I'll make sure you're living in a caravan before you can say legacy." She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes searching for the girl she'd thrown out. That girl was gone. "Fine," she croaked. "You want your pound of flesh? Take it." She signed. Page after page, her signature shrinking with every line, her hands trembling. When it was done, she looked up at me, nothing left to hide behind. "Are you happy now?" she asked. I stood, gathering the papers. "Ask me again in a year." When she left, the office was quiet, except for the faint buzz of the city outside. I sat there for a long time, staring at the stack of signed documents. It should have felt like victory. It felt like a funeral. Declan came in later, finding me still at my desk. He perched on the edge, studying my face. "You did it," he said. "Yeah." "Is it enough?" I looked past him, out the window at the city I'd carved my name into, the city I'd bled for, fought for, rebuilt myself for. "It's a start." He squeezed my shoulder. "Come on, let's get out of here, take a break. A day off." But I couldn't. I wasn't ready. There were still debts unpaid. Old ghosts that didn't die just because you signed the last dotted line. I didn't know it yet, but the hardest chapter was still waiting. Because once you've torn down the house that hurt you, you have to figure out what to build in its place. And revenge is easy. Living is the part that breaks you. After Verity signed everything over, the silence was the strangest part. I'd expected noise, calls, threats, some last attempt at sabotage. But there was nothing. Just the quiet hum of my office at night, the shuffle of paper as my team filed the final transfers, and the weight of all that empty space where rage used to be. Declan insisted I take a day. "Do nothing," he said. "Get out of your own head for 5 minutes." So I did something I hadn't done in years. I went back to Manchester, to the old neighborhood where my mother used to hold my hand as we walked to the corner shop, where the kids would jump rope in the alleyway behind the tower blocks. The buildings hadn't changed much, the bricks still crumbled in the same places, the paint still peeled like old scabs. I stood outside the flat that used to be ours. A new family lived there now. Someone had planted a window box with half-dead flowers. I wondered if they knew the ghosts that clung to the walls. If they could hear my mother's laughter the way I still did sometimes, in the quiet moments when success didn't fill the void. I stayed there until the sun dipped behind the clouds, turning the streetlights into halos. And then I went to the one place I'd avoided all these years, the cemetery on the hill. Her grave was exactly where I'd left it, a cheap stone, worn smooth by rain, the name barely legible now. I sat cross-legged in the damp grass, tracing the letters with my thumb. "You'd hate this," I whispered. "You'd say it wasn't worth it, that they weren't worth it." I could almost hear her telling me to stop fighting shadows, to forgive, to let go. But I wasn't built like her. My forgiveness had a cost, and they'd paid it in full. When I got back to London, I told Declan I was ready. He didn't ask if I meant ready to build or ready to bury what was left. He just cleared his schedule and sat with me as I mapped out what came next. Owning the company was one thing. Running it was another. The estate's old guard, lawyers, accountants, board members who'd clung to Verity like barnacles, lined up at my door, each one rehearsing their careful pitch. Each one hoping I'd keep things exactly as they were, but I hadn't torn it all down to preserve the rot. I fired half of them in the first week. The press called me ruthless, cold-blooded. The Ice Queen of Kensington, one headline sneered. I pinned it to my office wall as a reminder. They could call me whatever they wanted. They didn't have to live with the choices I'd made. They didn't know what it felt like to have nothing but a plastic bag of clothes and a bus ticket back to nowhere. Arabella came to see me once. She swept into my office like she owned the air, her perfume so strong it choked the space between us. "Congratulations, Callista," she said, dropping into the chair across from my desk. "You've won. Is this the part where you rub it in my face?" I didn't look up from the file I was reading. "If I wanted to do that, I'd have invited you to the press conference." She laughed, a brittle, tinkling sound that didn't reach her eyes. "You always were such a martyr. You know that? I tried to warn Verity not to push you out, but she wouldn't listen." I met her gaze then. "You watched. You let it happen." Her smile didn't waver, but the corners cracked. "And now? We're all under your thumb. Congratulations, cousin. Truly." She left before I could decide whether to hate her or pity her. Maybe both. Noel called late that night. "It's done," he said. "Everything's clean. You own every last piece of them." I thanked him and sat there alone, the city lights glittering like broken glass. I should have felt free. I should have felt something. But there was always another ghost. Another debt. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I worked. In the mornings, I walked through the new offices I'd built inside the old estate walls. The ballroom where they'd once laughed at me was now a co-working hub for startups too small to afford big city rents. The old stables held an art incubator for local kids. I gave away grants like sweets, money I'd never see again, but hope I could taste in the air when I watched them dream bigger than I ever did at their age. Some nights, I'd sit in the garden outside the main house. Verity stayed in the east wing, the only piece she'd kept. I'd see her light flick on sometimes, a shadow at the window. We never spoke. I wondered what she thought when she looked out at the land she'd once ruled. Did she see weeds where roses used to be? Or did she see me standing there under the stars, daring her to come out and reclaim what she'd lost? Declan said I should move on, that the estate was just a place now. But it wasn't. It was the stone I'd carved my name into, the wound I'd chosen to leave open so I'd never forget. One evening a letter arrived, heavy paper, no return address. Inside, an invitation. A charity gala hosted by an old rival family, one that had once turned their back on me the same way the Wrens had. They wanted me there, not as a guest, but as the keynote speaker. Declan found me pacing my office. You going to accept? He asked. What do you think? He leaned against my desk, arms folded. I think you're about to walk into a lion's den, just to prove you can wrestle the biggest one. He paused. But maybe you don't have to fight everyone anymore. I stopped pacing, staring at him. What if fighting is the only thing I know how to do? He smiled, sad and soft. Then maybe it's time to learn something else. I went to the gala. The hall was gold and marble, and 1,000 eyes that flicked over me like they were trying to rewrite my story in real time. I wore black. No jewelry, no flash. Just me, and the name they'd tried to bury. When they called me up, I stood behind the podium, hands steady for the first time in years. They say you can't choose your family, I began, my voice echoing through the hush. But you can choose who you stand for, who you lift up, who you fight for when there's nothing left to gain. A murmur rippled through the room. The old guard shifted in their seats. I was taught that family means loyalty. It means protection. It means standing together, even when it costs you. I paused, scanning the faces. I found Arabella near the back, her eyes wide and wet. Declan stood beside her, hands in his pockets, that ghost of a smile that always reminded me who I'd become. Some families forget that, I said. And some of us have to remind them. I stepped down to silence. Then, applause. Slow at first, then rising, filling the hall with the kind of warmth I'd thought I'd buried for good. Afterwards, people came to shake my hand, to tell me they were inspired, that I was proof you could claw your way back and still build something better from the ruin. But in the quiet of the car ride home, Declan turned to me. Is it enough now? He asked. I watched the city blur by, lights streaking like stars caught in glass. Almost, I said. Almost. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now back to the story. I knew then that the final piece wasn't taking. It was giving, not just money, but my story. The truth of it. The ugly parts. The nights in bus stations. The days I wanted to disappear. So I started to write it down. Not for Verity, not for the press. For the kids in the art incubator. For the interns who asked me if it was really true that I'd once had nothing. I wrote it for the girl who slept under a street lamp with her coat for a blanket. I wrote it for me, and when the last page was done, I sat on the balcony of my townhome, a glass of cheap wine in my hand, watching the city breathe below me. This was the beginning, I realized, not the end. This was what it meant to win without losing yourself. I raised my glass to the ghost of my mother, to the girl I'd buried 1,000 times just to survive. We're still here, I whispered, and they can't take that away. I thought the story would end when I took back the estate. When I stood behind that podium and watched those old money faces pretend they'd never whispered about my threadbare coat. But winning, I'd learned, doesn't mean the fight is over. It just means you're strong enough to see the cracks you ignored before. 2 weeks after the gala, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me, some old reflex for pain and curiosity, made me swipe to answer. Callista Wren? The voice was gravelly old, edged with cigarettes and regret. Yes, this is Margot Layton. I knew your mother. I sat down, my knees suddenly too weak to hold me up. I hadn't heard that name in 20 years. Margot Layton, my mother's best friend, the one who'd given me bus fare when we couldn't afford it. The one who'd disappeared when the sickness got bad and the rent collectors started pounding on our door. Why are you calling me now? I asked, my voice sharper than I meant. Margot sighed on the other end of the line. Because there are things you don't know. About her. About you. About the Wrens. I didn't want to listen, but I did. I always did. She told me about the debt my mother had taken on when my father left. About the money she'd borrowed, secretly, desperately, to keep a roof over our heads. Money she'd hidden, believing she'd pay it back when her painting sold, when her little market stall grew into something real. But she never did. And when she died, that debt didn't die with her. You think Verity threw you out because you were poor, Margot rasped. But it wasn't just that. Your mother borrowed from the family trust. Without permission. She was meant to pay it back. Verity saw it as a betrayal. A stain on the name. I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles whitened. Why didn't she tell me? She wanted to protect you, Margot said. She thought if she carried the shame alone, you'd have a chance. A chance. I'd spent my whole life fighting for a seat at a table I never really wanted. For a name that wasn't even mine to claim. Margot told me she still had letters. Paintings. Sketches my mother never sold. Proof of who she was before the Wrens turned her into a ghost story. Come see me, Margot said. Come see who you really are. So I did. I took the train out to a small town in Sussex. All fog and seagulls and rusted pier railings. Margot lived in a cramped bungalow that smelled like oil paint and cats. She was thin now, skin paper thin, hair shock white. But her eyes were the same. Sharp, knowing, unafraid. She led me to a tiny back room, every inch stacked with canvas and boxes of old letters tied with string. My mother's handwriting stared up at me, loops and flourishes I hadn't seen since I was 12. I sat on the paint-splattered floor for hours reading. Letters about me, my first steps, my stubborn streak, my sketches on the kitchen wall she'd never paint over. Letters about her dreams. Buying a little shop, teaching me to run it, growing old with the smell of turpentine and sunlight in her hair. None of them mentioned the Wrens. Not once. It struck me then. The family I'd fought so hard to beat was never really my family. Not the way she'd meant it. She'd wanted more from me than their cold marble halls and bitter tea. She'd wanted freedom. I left Margot's with 3 canvases under my arm, each one signed with my mother's name, bright swirls of color that felt like an open window on a spring morning. I hung them in my townhouse where I'd see them every day. I thought that would be enough, but the ghost in my head whispered, "Do more." So I did. I turned the old stables, once the storage space for dusty carriages and the family's prized hunting dogs, into a gallery. Not for Verity's portraits or the Wrens' brittle ancestral oils, but for local artists. Kids who'd been told they'd never make it, who painted on cardboard and scrap wood because they couldn't afford a real canvas. Opening night, the hall was packed. Journalists came, more out of curiosity than support. They asked me if this was penance, some PR move to soften my reputation as the Ice Queen. I told them the truth. This is my mother's legacy, I said. And mine. Verity didn't come, but Arabella did. She drifted through the gallery like a ghost, stopping in front of a painting by a boy from East London, who'd done his first sketches on takeaway menus. She didn't say a word to me, but when she left, I saw her slip an envelope into the donations box. Maybe guilt could be art, too. Months passed. The estate transformed. The trust rebuilt itself. Slowly, carefully, under my hand. Not Verity's iron fist. The new businesses thrived. The garden parties became community fairs, open to kids from the village who'd once been turned away at the gates. I still got calls from people wanting favors, wanting money, wanting pieces of me. But the difference now was I knew which voices to listen to. One morning, Declan knocked on my office door. "You ready for your next fight?" he asked. I raised an eyebrow. "What's this one about?" He tossed a newspaper onto my desk. The headline made my stomach drop. Wright Holdings, his company, was under threat. A hostile takeover. The same game we'd played with the Wrens, now turned against us. "They think if they squeeze me, they can squeeze you," Declan said. "They want you out." I looked at him, my friend, my partner, the man who'd stood beside me when no one else did. "Then we don't let them," I said. And just like that, the fight began again. But this time, it wasn't about revenge. It was about protecting the people who'd become my real family, the ones who chose me when blood didn't. We worked side by side for weeks, untangling the financial knots the takeover artists had wrapped around Wright Holdings. We leaned on every connection, every ally, every lesson we'd learned from watching Verity try to bleed us dry. In the end, it came down to a vote, a room full of shareholders staring at us like predators circling prey. I stood up and spoke for Declan. For the kids who'd get squeezed out if the company fell. For the businesses we'd built on trust and grit and second chances. When the final ballots were counted, we won. Barely. But a win is a win. Afterwards, Declan and I sat on the steps outside the old estate house, looking out over the gardens my mother would have loved. "You ever get tired?" he asked me. "Every day," I said. "But it's different now." He nudged me. "How so?" I thought about the bus station, the graveyard, the night I walked away, with nothing. And then I looked at the lights of the new businesses, the gallery, the kids painting with real brushes on real canvas. "Now I get to choose what I'm fighting for," I said. He grinned, tired but real. "Good answer." I leaned back, feeling the cold stone at my shoulders. Somewhere inside, Verity probably watched us from her window. I hoped she did. I hoped she saw what I'd made from the ashes of her empire. My phone buzzed with a message from the gallery manager. A new artist. 16 years old. Already had offers from big city dealers. She wanted to meet me. I texted back. "Tell her my door's open." And it was. Always would be. Because family isn't what you're born into. It's what you fight for. It's what you protect when the world tries to take it away. And this time, I wasn't letting go. When you win a battle, the world expects you to rest. They expect you to sit on your throne, drink your champagne, and pretend the scars don't itch at night. But rest has never sat well with me. After Declan's company survived the takeover, the calls started again. Offers, interviews, investors who wanted to stitch themselves to my name like we shared the same skin. I turned down most of them, but there was one I couldn't ignore. The message came in late, past midnight, when London's hum turns into a lullaby for the restless. I was sitting on the balcony, my mother's painting propped against my knees, when my phone lit up with a number I'd never seen. "Ms. Wren?" The voice was young, but it carried that slight edge I recognized instantly. Desperation, hope, and a hint of fear. "My name is Lila Porter. I know you don't know me, but I think you knew my father." I sat up, my heart stuttering. "Who's your father?" "Oliver Porter. He worked with you. On the right expansion." Oliver. God. He'd been one of our brightest managers. Smart, kind, the sort of person who asked the interns if they'd eaten lunch when everyone else forgot. I remembered the last time I'd seen him. A handshake in the lobby, a promise to catch up over coffee soon. "I'm sorry," I said softly. "I haven't heard from him in a while. Is he okay?" A silence, raw and wide. "He died. 3 months ago." I closed my eyes, the weight of another ghost settling on my shoulders. "I'm so sorry, Lila, truly." "He talked about you," she said. "About how you helped him when he needed it. He left me everything." "But there's nothing left, Ms. Wren. The debts. They're trying to take our house. I didn't know who else to call." Her voice cracked then, the sound of someone trying not to drown. I didn't think twice. "Where are you?" "Sheffield." "Stay put," I said. "I'm coming to you." Declan tried to stop me the next morning. "You can't save everyone, Cal." I shrugged on my coat, ignoring the exhaustion clinging to my bones. "Maybe not, but I can save her." He didn't argue. He just pressed a cup of tea into my hand. "Be careful." Sheffield in winter is all gray drizzle and cracked pavements. Lila lived in a terrace house that looked ready to fold in on itself. She answered the door wrapped in a cardigan 3 sizes too big, her eyes wide and hollow in the morning light. She couldn't have been more than 20. "You didn't have to come," she said, voice small as she led me into the tiny front room. "I just thought—" "You called," I said. "That's enough." The house smelled of damp and stale takeaway. A single photo of Oliver sat on the mantel. Him at a barbecue, grinning, a paper plate in hand like he'd just cracked a joke he couldn't wait to share. I sat with Lila for hours. She showed me the letters from the debt collectors, the foreclosure notice, the stack of unpaid bills. She tried to work 3 jobs while finishing her degree. It still wasn't enough. "He always said he'd leave me secure," she whispered. "But when the company went through the merger, he cashed out some stock to cover my tuition. Then the market tanked. He never told me how bad it got. You'd think that after giving part of the estate back to the village, the calls would stop, that the reporters would lose interest, that the whispers about the Ice Queen melting would fade into the next scandal. But the thing about power is this: once you have it, everyone wants to test if you're still sharp enough to keep it. A month after the trust was signed, I woke to find a letter slipped under my door. No stamp, no return address, just my name, handwritten in ink that bled a little where someone's palm had sweated over it. Inside, a single sentence: "You've paid your debt in money. Now pay it in truth." I read it 3 times, waiting for the chill to subside. I thought of Verity, Arabella, the cousins who drifted off like shadows when they realized I wouldn't be their purse strings. I thought of my mother's letters tucked in my desk drawer, and Margot's voice reminding me that secrets don't stay buried forever. I could have ignored it, pretended it was a prank, or some desperate plea from a villager who thought they deserved more. But the truth was, I knew exactly what it meant. The family archives, somewhere in the estate, hidden behind decades of locked doors and dusty ledgers, lay the records Verity and the old guard had buried. Deeds that proved the land hadn't just been bought, it had been taken. Testimonies from the servants they'd paid off, the local businesses they'd crushed, and somewhere in that mountain of brittle paper, the truth about my mother. I told Declan I needed a few days alone. He didn't argue. He just told me to call if I found more ghosts than I could carry. I started in the east wing, the oldest part of the house. It had always smelled like lavender and mildew, the heavy drapes clinging to the windows like forgotten prayers. The family library sat at the end of the hall, a room I'd been banned from as a child because some things aren't for little girls with dirty shoes. Now the door swung open under my hand like it had been waiting. Dust rose in soft clouds around me. The shelves were floor to ceiling, crammed with leather-bound volumes, some so old they looked like they'd crumble if I breathed too hard. I found the lockbox behind the 3rd shelf, just as Percy the butler had once told me in a rare moment of kindness. It took me 3 tries to crack the combination: my birthday, my mother's. The date Verity threw me out, the last one worked. Inside, a stack of papers tied with red ribbon, wills, loan agreements, bribes disguised as gifts, and at the very bottom a small bundle of letters in my mother's handwriting. Letters I'd never seen. I sank to the floor, cross-legged on the cold wood, and read until the words blurred. My mother had begged for help when the debts piled up. Verity had promised her temporary relief in exchange for signing over her small inheritance, my inheritance. When my mother couldn't repay, Verity had used it as proof she was untrustworthy. The story spread through the family like rot. It wasn't enough for them to let her die alone. They had to make sure I'd grow up believing we deserved it. I pressed my palm to the letters like I could reach through time and pull her back. I whispered all the things I'd never said. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I know now." When I emerged from the library, dawn was just beginning to stain the sky. I carried the letters like a torch, the final piece of the fire I'd been building since the night they threw me out. By noon, the village hall was full. I'd called an open meeting. Anyone connected to the estate, the businesses, the trust? Some came curious. Some came afraid. And at the front, under the same creaking beams, where my mother once sold her paintings at the winter fair, I laid the truth bare. I read her letters out loud. I read the documents that showed the land grabs, the stolen wages, the forced evictions. I read until my throat burned and my hands trembled. When I finished, no one clapped. There was only silence, heavy, raw, the kind that settles in your bones when you realize the foundations you've built your life on were made of someone else's suffering. Arabella stood up first. She didn't look at me, she just said, "What happens now?" "Now," I said, "we fix it." I opened the floor to them. Real reparations, not just charity. Land grants to families whose deeds had been buried. Funding for apprenticeships, for businesses crushed by the old regime. A scholarship in my mother's name, for any artist who needed a chance the way she never got one. Some called me naive. Some called me a traitor to my own blood. I let them. Their words were softer than the ones I'd carved into my heart years ago. Afterwards, I walked back to the orchard. The kids were there again, chasing each other under the same branches that once shaded Verity's garden parties. A little girl with a paintbrush in her hair sat on a blanket, sketching the trees like she'd discovered her own private kingdom. She looked up at me, shy but proud. "Do you want to see?" I knelt beside her. Her drawing was wild, colorful, full of life, nothing like the stiff portraits that lined the estate's halls. "It's beautiful," I said. "What's your name?" "Clara," she said. "I want to be an artist." "Then you will be," I said. "I promise." When I got back to the house, Arabella was waiting for me. She held out a glass of wine like a peace offering. "You really mean to tear it all down, don't you?" "No," I said, taking the glass. "I mean to build something better." She looked around the hall that had once echoed with our ancestors' lies. "And when people come for you, when they say you're soft, that you're giving it all away?" I raised my glass. "Let them. They'll be too busy trying to catch up." That night, I sat at my mother's grave again. This time, I didn't cry. I just told her everything. How the letters were out in the open. How the people she loved were getting back what was stolen. How I'd made sure her name would never be spoken with pity again. A wind rustled through the grass like she was answering me. Or maybe it was just the world shifting, finally, to let in a little more light. When I left, I felt the weight lift. Not all of it, but enough to stand straighter. To breathe deeper. Declan found me on the steps of the main house when I returned. He didn't say anything. He just sat beside me, shoulder to shoulder, the way he always did when the ghosts got too loud. "So?" he said after a while. "What now?" I thought about the orchard. The girl with the sketchbook. The village hall that didn't echo anymore with secrets but with hope. "Now," I said. "We grow." We sat there until the sun rose over the hills, turning the old stones gold. And for the first time since they'd thrown me out, I believed it was possible. There's a strange quiet that comes after the truth has been spoken. It's not peace, at least not yet. It's more like the hush that settles over a field after a storm has passed. The soil is soaked, the branches are broken, but the air tastes like something new might grow if you're brave enough to plant it. In the weeks that followed the meeting in the village hall, I saw parts of my family for who they really were. Arabella stayed close, hovering around the new trust meetings, drifting through the orchard with a notebook she never let anyone see. Sometimes she'd catch me watching her and smile, like we were children again, before all the sharp edges dulled us. Edgar was nowhere to be found. Rumor was he'd skipped the country, the weight of scandal pressing down harder than his liver ever could. Verity, though. Verity stayed. We didn't speak, not directly, but I'd see her light at night in the east wing window, flickering like a lighthouse for a ship that would never dock. Declan kept asking me, "What comes next?" He was patient, as always, but his eyes told me he wanted me to let it rest. To let myself rest. But I wasn't done. You see, when you spend your whole life fighting, winning feels like a job half finished. And I wasn't foolish enough to think the land grants and scholarships would erase the rot. They were seeds, not cures. So I started to dig deeper, into the businesses the family still had fingers in, the ones that operated quietly, tucked behind charity boards and glossy annual reports. I found them in shell companies in Switzerland, in off-the-books ventures that made money by squeezing the very people they claimed to serve. One, a property management firm, had been buying up flats in London's poorest boroughs, jacking up rents until families were forced to share single rooms like sardines. Another controlled the supply chain for a fair trade brand that paid their workers pennies while executives toasted each other at sustainability galas. Every file Noel slid across my desk was another match waiting to be struck. "You can't take on all of it alone," Declan warned one night, his voice low over the hum of my old kettle. "It'll swallow you." "Then I'll get bigger," I said. "If they're going to call me a queen, I might as well be one who actually protects something." He didn't smile. He just squeezed my shoulder and left me to my maps, my files, my growing army of people who'd once called themselves invisible. I did it the same way I'd done everything else, quietly, piece by piece. I reached out to tenants' unions, to fair wage organizers, to the young, bright-eyed lawyers who still believed a single case could shift the tide. I gave them what Verity once denied my mother: money, connections, shelter from the storms they were about to face. Some nights, I fell asleep at my desk, the soft scratch of Clara's latest painting on the gallery wall, the last thing I saw before my eyes closed. She came to the orchard every day now, dragging her mother along, showing her the new studio space we'd built in the old gatehouse. "You saved us," her mother said once, tears slipping down her cheeks as Clara ran ahead. "No," I said, handing her a fresh set of paintbrushes for her daughter. "I just opened the door. You walked through it." But the ghosts weren't done with me yet. One morning, Percy the butler appeared in my office, his white gloves folded in his trembling hands. He was older now, bones thin under his coat, but his eyes were sharp as ever. "Miss Wren," he said, bowing slightly. "She wants to see you." I didn't have to ask who she was. Verity's room in the east wing smelled like old roses and wood polish. The heavy curtains were drawn back, letting the gray winter light spill across the four-poster bed, where she sat propped up by cushions. She looked smaller than I remembered, shrunken, her hair a halo of white around a face that once commanded rooms with a single glance. "Callista," she said, her voice a rasp that cut through the hush, "do you think you've won?" I stood at the foot of her bed, my hands folded behind me like a schoolgirl waiting for a scolding that would never land. "No," I said. "I don't think this is about winning anymore." She laughed, a brittle sound, paper tearing. "I should have loved you better. That was my mistake." I didn't flinch. "Yes," I said, "it was." Her eyes flicked to the window where the orchard lay bare under a coat of frost. "You remind me of your mother." "She deserved better than this," I said. "Than you." Verity nodded slowly. "And now you'll give them what I wouldn't. Is that it? Your penance?" I stepped closer, close enough to see the way her fingers trembled against the silk blanket. "No," I said. "Not penance. Balance." She closed her eyes then. "I hope it's enough for you, Callista. I truly do." "I don't need your hope," I said. "Just your silence." I left her there, staring out the window at the orchard she'd once ruled like a kingdom. When the time came to bury her, I knew I wouldn't shed a tear. Spring came early that year. The orchard bloomed in pink and white, a canopy of blossoms that fell like snow whenever the children ran through it, chasing each other's laughter. One day, Clara tugged at my sleeve. "Will you paint with me?" she asked. I hesitated. My hands, once so sure with a pencil, felt clumsy now. But she pressed a brush into my palm like a promise. So we sat there, side by side under the flowering trees, dipping our brushes into the same bright colors my mother once loved. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't talk about Verity's light winking out like a star that had finally burned itself dry. We painted hope. We painted new beginnings. When Declan found me there, smudges of paint on my cheeks, he didn't ask if I was done fighting. He just sat on the blanket beside us, watching the orchard sway in the breeze. "What now, Cal?" he asked softly. I looked around at what we'd built. Not the house, not the old money, but the living, breathing thing that pulsed under the branches and paint and laughter. "Now," I said, "we make sure it lasts." And I knew we would. Because this time, I wasn't doing it alone. The last blossom fell from the orchard the week we laid Verity to rest. It was an unremarkable funeral for a woman who'd once demanded entire towns turn out in their Sunday best just to see her wave from the estate gates. Arabella stood beside me at the graveside, the wind tugging at the black veil she didn't bother to pull down. "Do you feel anything?" she whispered when the priest droned on about loyalty and legacy. I didn't look at her. My eyes were fixed on the small, mean patch of earth where we'd lowered the coffin. "Yes," I said, relief. She didn't answer, but when the final clod of dirt landed, I felt her hand slip into mine. A bond made not from blood, but from the bruises we carried where no one could see. Afterwards, the mourners drifted back toward the house. The villagers who came did so out of politeness, leaving bunches of flowers at the gate before they disappeared down the long, winding road. By dusk, it was just me and Arabella and Declan, the last three standing on ground that had been a prison, a throne, a battlefield. I walked alone through the orchard that night, The branches stretched bare against a moonless sky, but in my mind they still dripped with blossom and the giggles of children who didn't know this land was once soaked with greed. I found Clara's latest painting propped against the old stone wall, a swirl of blue and green, a tree with roots that glowed like veins beneath the earth. Hope made real in brushstrokes. I picked it up, cradled it to my chest, and for the first time I believed this place could grow something better. The next morning, I did what I promised myself I would never do again. I gathered the family. Not just Arabella or the distant cousins still sniffing around for scraps, but the entire new family I'd chosen. Declan, Clara and her mother, the artists and the students, and the council members who'd stood with me when the old walls started to crack. We met in the ballroom, the same ballroom where they'd once laughed at my thrift store shoes, my empty pockets. The chandeliers still sparkled, but now the tables were set with plans and sketches and mugs of cheap coffee, not caviar and champagne. "We're here because this is ours now," I said when the room fell quiet. "And we're not just going to keep it. We're going to make sure no one ever uses it to hurt people again." I told them about the new trust, the real one this time. The papers were signed that morning. Half of the estate's profits funneled straight into community projects, apprenticeships, and microloans for anyone who needed a step up, not a handout they'd be shamed for. Arabella raised her glass, water, not wine, and murmured, "To new blood." She winked at me when she said it, and the whole room laughed like we'd just cracked open the ceiling to let the sun pour in. When the meeting ended, Declan pulled me aside. "Are you finally going to rest now?" he asked. I glanced out the ballroom windows where Clara was showing her mother the wall she wanted to paint a mural on, a whole history of this place in color and motion. "Not yet," I said. "Almost." In the weeks that followed, I did what my mother would have done if she'd had the chance. I painted. Not for money. Not for galleries. But for the kids who'd stand in the orchard and wonder if they were worth anything more than the shadows their parents left behind. Every wall that once held oil portraits of men in powdered wigs now bloomed with wildflowers, sunrise colors, and faces of people who'd never have been invited through the gates before. At night, I'd find Declan sitting by the old fountain, watching the stars blink awake. He always left space beside him, a blanket tucked around his shoulders, 2 cups of tea cooling on the stone rim. "You're really not tired of this yet?" I asked him once, curling up next to him. "Watching you drag this house into the future? Never," he said. Then, softer. "You know it's not just yours anymore, right?" I nodded. "It never was. That's the point." We sat like that for hours, the cold biting at our cheeks, but the warmth between us enough to make the dark feel safe for once. When the mural in the orchard was done, Clara asked if she could show it off. So we opened the gates, wide, without tickets or lists or names to check. Hundreds came, some curious, some skeptical, but most with eyes that widened like children seeing magic for the first time. There, under the arch of branches and flowers, we watched a new story take root. One where family wasn't a weapon but a promise. One where no one was left outside in the cold because their shoes weren't shiny enough. Arabella stood beside me that day, a paintbrush tucked behind her ear. "Do you ever think she'd hate this?" she asked, nodding toward Verity's grave, somewhere beyond the trees. I smiled. "Absolutely." She laughed, and for the first time since we were girls, it wasn't brittle or bitter, just real. When the sun dipped and the orchard lights flickered on, Declan pulled me into the middle of the path. "Dance with me," he said. "There's no music," I protested. "We'll make our own," he said. So we did. Slow steps over roots and fallen petals, the echo of our laughter carrying into the night. At the edge of the orchard, Clara ran to us, waving a flyer for her first gallery show, one she'd curated with the other kids, who now called the old stables their studio. "I put your name on the invite," she said, breathless. "You have to come." "I wouldn't miss it," I said, pressing the paper to my chest like it was the only treasure I'd ever need. That night, after the last lantern went out and the laughter faded into dreams, I stood at the window of my mother's old room. It had been empty for so long. Now it was mine. Not to hoard, but to remember. I placed one of her paintings on the sill, facing the orchard. A promise in oils and light. You were here, you mattered, and now so do I. Tomorrow, there would be new problems, more fights, old money wolves trying to circle, new ghosts knocking on the door. But tonight, under this roof, in this body I'd bled and burned for, I felt it. I was home. Not because they let me back in, because I built a door no one could lock behind me again, because family isn't who you're born to. It's who stands with you when the world says you shouldn't matter. And when you've lost everything, sometimes that's how you find what's worth saving. So here's my story. I was thrown out for being poor. I came back as the woman they'd never dare shut out again. But the greatest revenge wasn't taking what they owed me. It was giving what they'd always denied, a place to belong, no matter what you have, or don't. And maybe that's what real power is. Not the land, not the title, but the open gates and the hands you reach out to lift someone else over the walls you've torn down. So if you're standing outside, coat pulled tight against the cold, thinking you'll never be enough, come find me. My door's open. Always. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.